Hi, everybody. My name's Caitlin Breedlove. I'm the campaign director for Standing on the Side of Love, and this is Organizing on the Side of Love, our first course, Module 1. This is Movement Building and Organizing 101, and I'm really excited to have this be some information that starts some conversation with y'all. Okay, hopefully out there in the interwebs you can see community organizing and movement building, aka the structure and the wave. So, what is community organizing and what is movement building? We know that when Obama became president, all of a sudden the right wing was saying, oh, what is a community organizer? Who is that? We know that people talk about civil rights movement, the LGBTQ rights movement, Black liberation movement. What is a movement? Where to start? So there's a lot to say. And like we talked about a little bit on frequently asked questions, this is not comprehensive. This is a way to start to get some tips and tools for what this stuff might be. So community organizing is traditionally seen as the process wherein people who live in proximity to each other come together in an organization that acts in their self-interest. Community organizers generally assume that social change necessarily involves conflict and social struggle in order to generate collective power for the structurally powerless. Community organizers work with and develop new local leaders, facilitating coalitions and assisting in the development of campaigns. Organizing is sometimes referred to most succinctly as unite to fight. So let's unpack this for a second and talk about what all of this means. So basically, when you look at traditional community organizing, it often happened in neighborhoods. So we're going to talk a little bit about the history. There's a dude named Saul Alinsky who is often associated with this term doing work in Chicago. A classic example, however, is people coming together in a neighborhood to try to change something, whether that's speed bumps, stoplights, something a lot bigger like the way their community is being policed. So while Saul Alinsky came up with the term, a lot of us know that many folks in the community have been doing this work for a long time, particularly working class folks. Women of color have traditionally been centers of communities when it comes to how neighborhoods are organized, how they're doing this work. The second part is talking about the question of social change necessarily involving conflict and social struggle in order to generate collective power. So we're going to talk quite a bit more about this, but it all goes back to a basic quote from Frederick Douglass, which we're going to come to, which is that power concedes nothing without a fight. So this is a really important spiritual question, because does that mean that community organizing is based on the idea that everything is, quote, a fight in a militaristic sense of the word? Not necessarily. What it does mean is that oftentimes when people have something, they're not going to want to give it up. And so those who are being structurally disempowered from it are going to have to push, confront, and struggle in order to get people with power to move. So we're going to come back to that and talk more about it, but we don't want to skip over it in this definition. So working with and developing new leaders, facilitating coalitions, assisting in development campaigns, we're going to come back to a lot of that. The reason unite to fight is important as a term in a basic understanding is that it means a couple things. One, community organizing is not community organizing if you're doing it alone. So if you're an individual diva, if you have a very big mic, if you have a very big audience, you could be doing really interesting activism. You could be doing really interesting communications work, but it is not community organizing if you are solo and doing it on your own. Another major principle of community organizing is if an organization is not growing, it's dying. Sounds harsh, but what does it actually mean? It means that as you're developing new leaders, some leaders are always leaving because life happens. And when you're working with deeply marginalized people, life is always happening because white supremacy, poverty, oppression bring chaos into people's lives. People are becoming incarcerated. Horrifyingly, people are sometimes passing away. People are dealing with issues of addiction. People are dealing with issues of drama. People are just tired and leaving the work. All of this is happening. And so if you are not bringing new people in and supporting people to stay in, the organizations are shrinking, which means that an organizer's work is not to just get great at everything and then be like, look, I got it. It's to be constantly developing folks, right? And so that's another basic organizing principle that when people talk about classic organizing, don't do for people what they can do for themselves, which is particularly important when we talk about how people are able to be self-determined in organizing, and we're going to come to that. But that essentially means that people are self-determining their own goals, what's important to them, and that a lead organizer is transferring skills all the time so that people have more skills, not less. Okay, we're going to talk about coalitions a little bit later and campaigns as well. But I want folks to keep that in their mind because that's one of the first questions about how we're just naming the whole piece of what community organizing is. Grassroots organizing is most of what organizing is, but we want to put a specific point on it because there are different kinds of organizing, which means that you're just organizing different circles with different spheres, and those folks have different access to power. Grassroots organizing means you're mostly working with people who have very little access to power on the ground. It builds community groups from scratch, developing new leadership where none existed, and organizing the unorganized. Most would agree that grassroots organizing is often thankless work that is under-resourced and often delegitimized and co-opted. So when we say it builds community groups from scratch, developing new leadership where none existed, that doesn't mean that communities don't have leadership, strengths, impulses, intuitions, or they're not organically organizing themselves all the time. It means that they're organizing themselves into something that builds power and that is actually able to move and manifest and exercise that power. And that is what becomes different with grassroots organizing. Now, I want to be really clear about this. This doesn't mean, sometimes when people talk about this, they think, well, that means grassroots organizing is like working in communities that are a desert of leadership or infrastructure. That's absolutely not the case. Actually, communities are teeming with resilient organization all the time. What they are structurally stripped of is the kind of resources that would help them exercise power. So a perfect example of that would be food deserts, right? You're looking at communities where there actually isn't healthy, affordable groceries as a gathering space for the community. You're looking at poor communities where the most central businesses that are moving in are check cashing places that rip people off, are liquor stores, right? And yet people are still managing to get organized and be in community, but they're dealing with the logistics of housing, neighborhoods, and infrastructure that makes it hard to do that. Highways going through poor communities is another huge example, particularly poor communities of color. Another example would be people not having houses in poor communities where there are good porches anymore, where they could actually connect with their neighbors, right? Smaller and smaller space for people. And then, of course, the ways that poor communities and communities of color are hyper-criminalized, constantly under surveillance, makes it really hard to build this infrastructure, which is all important when you think about grassroots organizing. And that's why I say many people see it as thankless work that's under-resourced, because most organizing of getting something done, quote unquote, is just easier to do in communities where there are a lot of resources. You can accomplish more traditional checklist organizing goals. In grassroots organizing, you have to really be able to understand the kind of time it takes, the kind of relationship it takes, the kind of trust building, and it's still very challenging. And so we want to be nuanced when we talk about these issues in this course, right? That we want to be real about the beauty and resilience in really marginalized communities, and we also want to be real about the challenges so that it's not a setup for people doing grassroots organizing. Okay, moving on. We're going to be a little briefer here on different kinds of organizing, because this could actually be 6 or 7 modules, not 2. But I wanted to give you 2 examples that when you Google different kinds of organizing, you'll get some different information. These are 2 that I think are really relevant for this course. Transformative organizing is the idea that people are transformed by the organizing itself. It seeks conscious leaders, conscious organizations, and long-term wins while using traditional organizing tools. It's often contrasted with pragmatic organizing, which is characterized as organizing for short-term wins or making deals with systems and being based in self-interest. So transformative organizing is often attributed to Eric Mann, the Movement Strategy Center, but many feel that while he coined the term, particularly women of color organizers and LGBTQ organizers were practicing it long before it was named this. It's a pretty simple idea in some ways, but I think really important for us to talk about because it actually gets to the heart of how people have different theories of change. So one theory of change says that the way you make long-term change is to make deals with systems. You have short-term wins. They're incremental. And as you're getting closer to power, you are getting closer to massive wins, and that's how you're going to succeed with social change at a bigger scale. Another form of organizing thinks that actually you have to consider movements as a whole, and that it doesn't often always come incrementally with small wins. You actually should not pick what's called low-hanging fruit, which would be incremental wins of things you think you can win, particular moments in history. You actually should go for the whole big vision. So I would contrast, the idea of Black Lives Matter is a really important concept because it actually leaves possibilities for both. For local communities to say, this is a local win around policing that really matters to us, and it has what's called an aspirational banner demand, right? Black lives need to matter. So that you can also say, no, for organizers who say, no, this needs to all happen at once, there's a place for them in that movement too. The idea that people are transformed by the organizing itself, we're going to talk about a lot more, but it's important to understand that, some organizers believe in this idea that you build a structure with organizing, which This Is an Uprising talks about really well in the early chapters, which is part of why I included it, right? That comes out of what's called Alinsky style organizing. You build a structure, you build a base, you go for smaller wins, and it's about issues, not movement, right? The wave, or movement-based, or some people call momentum-based organizing, is about you actually go for this big picture, you look for historical moments, and you pound in with aspirational demands, right? And you're moving very assertively into that particular moment. You're trying to move large numbers of people that are moved by the moment and the issue in a particular way. Those people might not have been organized in increments one by one, right? The reason that I add here the part about conscious leaders, conscious organizations, and long-term movement is also, I think, important when we talk about the bigger vision of change. So again, why I like This Is an Uprising is that these two kinds of organizing are talking to each other, right? They're having a conversation. Instead of it having to be either you totally believe in the structure or you totally believe in the wave, these things are in dialogue. And the argument, I think, is for some hybridity, understanding that both are important. I think what we do know for sure is that in social movements over the arc of history, there have been two important arguments that have been made. There is no social movement that hasn't had conscious leaders. And what we mean by that is organizers who are working in a very strategic, methodical way. So let's be specific about examples, right? We're going to use the civil rights movement as an example because it's one that I think most people in the audience of this course are familiar with. The civil rights movement had an Ella Baker. If you don't know who she is, Google her. Had a Martin Luther King Jr., had a Bayard Rustin, had these different individual leaders. And those leaders were building organization as well, some of them, but not all of them. Ella Baker was building with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, right? Dr. King was building with many organizations, but originally the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. So the leaders were building an organization. At the same time, is it a 1 + 1 = 2 that therefore you had movement? Because you had a King, a Baker, and a Rustin, and then you had an SCLC, a SNCC, and other organizations, and then you ended up with movement. No, there were a variety of variables and factors as well. There were new leaders coming on the scene. There were new organizations being built. There were direct actions that were of organizations that combusted or came together, groups of people who were building and then came apart. There was a great deal of sort of not easily quantifiable work happening that also became at play and was key to the movement itself. So what we know is that conscious leaders building conscious organization are a key part of movement. But we also know that there are other factors that are always arising. And that's why it's really important to understand that structure is important, but also flexibility to momentum is important as we're moving forward. Because without the flexibility to momentum, if Ella Baker would have said, no, the plan is we're going to make 20 leaders of SNCC, that's all we need. We're going to create what's called cadre, right? Which is a set of people actually linked together inside of ideology and shared vision for the work. There wouldn't have been the space for SNCC to become what it needed to be and for it then to play the role in movement that it needed to play. So that's why we think it's important to talk about these two pieces, the structure and the wave. Visionary organizing, I'm going to touch on briefly, partially because I think it's just really important to give a shout out to Grace Lee Boggs. Also, if you don't know who she is, give her a Google. So visionary organizing is characterized by long-term, deeply locally rooted feminist thinking and practice, and has similar ideas to transformative organizing, but comes primarily from Boggs, who identified as a Chinese-American community organizer who basically led 7 decades of activism, primarily in Black communities in Detroit. She also did theory production and organizing. So one of her core ideas is that we need to be evolutionaries and solutionaries, not just revolutionaries. So the idea of revolution is actually that something goes around in a wheel. That's the literal meaning, right? Like think about a bike wheel, goes in a circle, right? Grace Lee Boggs said, that's not enough. If we keep doing that after watching social movements and leading them and participating in them for 7 decades, we're going to continue to end up where we were. She believed that we need to do the evolutionary work where we actually become our best selves, our better selves all the time, practicing and iterating that, and that we're actually working on the solutions all the time. So she was a big believer, and this is going to come and play when we talk a little bit more about assessment and the current moment. She was a big believer in the muscle of critique only ever being as strong as the muscle of problem solving. And she was often quoted as saying that was one of the things she absolutely loved about working in Detroit, was that the situation in Detroit, because so much of the government infrastructure pulled out, they were actually working with people of all ages who were building work themselves. And so the problem solving ability was getting strengthened in the community all the time. And that was very important to her. So she passed away recently in the past few years. And so I think it's also important to hold up that partially because she was not compromising with systems too much and worked outside the grid, her work is sometimes not as recognized. Organizing to social movements. So we covered a lot of this already, but social movements are a type of collective action. They are large, sometimes informal groupings of individuals or organizations which focus on specific political or social issues. In other words, they carry out, resist, or undo a social change. We're going to talk about specific stories and examples in a minute. A little refresher from where we were last. Conscious organizers are the building blocks of organizations. Conscious organizations are a key element of social movements. But social movements always have an element of the mysterious and the alchemical. They're more than the sum of just predictable parts. So we talked a little bit about what that means a minute ago, but the alchemical simply means, to reiterate, 2 + 2 does not equal 4. There is never a simple chemical equation. Add water, add oxygen, you get this, right? That's actually not going to be the way that social movements move. There is always an element of change and adaptability. There is always an element of the unknown, and good organizers are flexible and ready to see those changes come. Okay, social movements, what they are and what they do. Social movements do engage existing leaders and bring new leaders into consciousness and motion for social change. They do engage existing organizations and create new ones. They do change the culture around their key issues and constituency, and they do often lead to policy and legal changes. So let's talk about a couple of specific examples or stories. So I come out of organizing with the LGBTQ movement I became politicized in the time where the AZT cocktail had not yet become um, well distributed or readily available for people. We know that now the cocktail is not available for all people who are HIV positive, depending on income level, but a lot more people have it than used to. So I was coming up in a time where we were still dealing with the kind of later events of HIV and AIDS, and in that period of history of the LGBTQ movement. So, what are some of the things that that movement has done over time, to use it as an example? There are many episodes and pieces of the history, um, but it has continued to, for example, engage existing leaders and bring new leaders into consciousness. So, coming out of Stonewall, which is another Googleable thing if you don't know what it is, but the uprising in a bar one hot night in June in 1968 that was led by trans women of color, specifically Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera. That's often seen as the beginning of the LGBTQ, quote, modern day liberation movement. So there were existing leaders, some of whom were very much not seen as respectable inside the establishment, right? They were sex workers, they were, you know, building community with each other. They were often very poor. They were living in big urban centers. They didn't necessarily have connection to blood families or wealth. And they were bringing, through their actions, new leaders into consciousness and motion for social change. And a lot of people had, you know, been experiencing the conditions that they then positioned a visible fight back to say, no, we're not going to be raped by the police anymore. We're not going to be constantly scrutinized for who we are, surveilled. We're not going to be terrorized in the communities that we're living in. And so when some leaders saw them fighting back, they became leaders themselves in a particular way. They were sort of nascent leaders, meaning they were still in their shell. And when they saw that visible courage, they started to come forward. Another example would be engaging existing organizations and creating new ones. At that time, there was almost no visible existing LGBTQ out organization, but the kind of submerged social networks started to come forward into organization, and the LGBTQ movement started building organization at a rapid speed from, you know, that day all the way forward. And so, you know, now we look today at, we have hundreds and hundreds of LGBTQ organizations that are out, that are playing all kinds of different roles in the community. Some of them not playing enough of the roles we want them to, but playing very significant roles, whether that's about young people, whether that's about elders, health, policy, legal, advocacy, organizing. If you don't know what a lot of those things are, no problem. They basically have to do with how are you fighting for the rights of the community in all these different ways, from the moment folks are born until they pass away, in every realm of their life. So their legal rights, their health, you know, our organizing and resistance, etc. So while it's imperfect, we actually have an ecosystem of organization. And then thinking about how you change the culture around key issues and constituency, we see a conversation about out LGBTQ people in every part of this country. And I want to be really clear that I don't think it's funders or famous people that make that happen. It's hundreds and thousands of LGBTQ people that took on the strategy of coming out in every small town and community, and our incredible allies who also then saw their brothers, sisters, cousins, teachers coming out and took up the movement. So that instead of saying we're going to change hearts and minds of 75% of just New York City or Seattle, for example, we're actually changing 10 to 15% of everywhere, from Macon, Georgia to Birmingham, Alabama to Santa Fe, New Mexico, you know, to all kinds of places. That's what we're doing. And then policy and legal changes. Clearly, we see some of them that have been more helpful than others, but a recent one is, you know, Obama's mandate that transgender young people can use bathrooms of their choice in their high schools. Social movements do not, which I think is also very important, fix all the problems for a constituency, engage everyone on every issue at hand, Consist of a fashion trend or a simple hashtag by itself, my personal favorite. So, a social movement, many times when people are coming into social movement, they are critical of the more engaged seasoned leaders because everything has not been fixed for a community. So let's stay with the example we're working right now because I know it well, and we'll keep on that one. The LGBTQ movement has actually not solved even the majority of the problems facing constituency, though we have made advancements and wins. That is not, the social movements are not able to do that all at once. We haven't seen a historical moment when that was able to happen. It's not in the history. History doesn't show us that's what they do. They're able to change pieces as we're moving along. They also do not engage everyone on every issue at hand. They tend to, for better or for worse, fight on a particular issue or set of issues, sometimes called a political platform, often winning and losing at different moments. All that to say, conscious leaders are also imperfect leaders. Conscious organizations are also imperfect organizations. And movements are deeply messy and imperfect. They're not the kind of work that people want to get into if they're looking for something squarely in a box that's going to win right away. They're a long-term aspirational set of campaigns, which we're going to talk about a little bit more in pieces of work. Consist of a fashion trend or a simple hashtag by itself. So a lot of times what we're hearing now, particularly I think from some folks who are maybe not engaged in movement for Black Lives, is, well, Black Lives Matter is just a hashtag. Well, there are a lot of hashtags. Black Lives Matter is much more than a hashtag. And why do we believe that to be the case? When we're watching, again, going back to what social movements do, let's ask ourselves if the movement for Black Lives is doing that. And I would say, in my opinion, it is. Is it engaging existing leaders? Yes. Is it bringing in new leaders? Yes. Is it engaging existing organizations and creating new ones? Yes. Is it changing the culture around key issues and constituency? Yes. Leading to policy and legal change? That's going to be a future question for the movement. But I actually think for some people, they're like, why hasn't BLM called for one policy change? Well, my opinion is that it's partially because the leadership didn't want to ceiling down the possibilities of movement by saying, give us this one thing, give us body cams for police officers, and then we're done. They actually wanted to move the movement up to its zenith of potential to engage new leaders in a variety of different ways. So that's something we can discuss more, but I think is an important distinction. Other things are simply a hashtag. We're moving in a world where a different hashtag is trending every day, but it's really important to be able to hold up the litmus test and see the difference. So when people ask us these questions, we can engage them. Movement building. So we're going to be a little briefer on this, even though there's a lot of information written on the page, but it's actually somewhat simple. So movement building is the long-term coordinated effort of individuals and organized groups of people to intentionally spark and sustain a social movement. Movement builders constantly engage core allies, the public, and people in positions of power to address systemic problems and promote alternative visions or solutions. Movement building can strengthen and provide direction during peak movement moments. In quieter times, movement building plays a crucial role in nurturing leadership, consciousness, and infrastructure. Movement building is a developmental process that depends on opportunity and conditions. That's from the Movement Strategy Center. And finally, some see community organizing as a localized process and movement building as a national or international organizing process or system. So some would argue that just like we talked about conscious leaders and conscious organization, that organizing itself is the process that works in a Chicago or a Boston or a Birmingham, right? And that movement building is when it becomes more at scale. It becomes regional, it becomes national, it becomes international. Why do I think this is an important thing to bring up? Well, for some people, they're like, you're doing organizing, but you just kind of seem like you're sitting around waiting for the weather to change for movement building. So one of the most important things on this slide, I think, is the in quieter times sentence, right? Movement building is not just about these zenith peaks. It's also about the people and organizations that are building with the hope and the belief in history that movements come. And so opportunity and conditions are important. And we're going to talk about that more when we talk about assessment. When are there opportunities to move? When is a play needed? And when is it not? Okay, this is one of my favorites. At their best, movements change who we are. Ella Baker, Sylvia Rivera, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Gandhi. In biographies, we hear about how growing movements changed who they were. But movements occur because thousands of unknown people are transformed and do more to better themselves and the world than they ever imagined they could. At the heart of movements led by the marginalized is a beginning of loving ourselves and turning to others who are hated and loving them. Allies often then bravely turn to us with love soon after. So let's talk about some examples. Thousands of people at lunch counters insisting on dignity, hundreds of thousands coming out for dignity and survival as LGBTQ, countless people around the globe saying, now Black lives must matter. Now is the time. This to me is the heart of a spiritual understanding of social movements. Because if we're not willing to be transformed in the service of this work, movements can't move. They don't have at the heart of them a particular ideology that is the one successful ideology or the one formula, like we talked about, that is the one successful formula. What they have at the heart of them is people who are transformed. The picture on the right comes from an action that Southerners Underground did, bringing together immigrant justice and LGBTQ justice. And the frame, Come Out, Destroy Fear, Unleash Power, references two major social movements. So it references ACT UP and a history of LGBTQ resistance while bringing it into the forefront during the Not One More Deportation campaign around justice for undocumented people. So I share it as a metaphor for all of the ways that people have named the transformation that social movements have meant for them and the spiritual component for it. And movements change our world. Someone thought of the idea of a weekend and then organizing it, the concept that we should have 5 days and then 2 days technically off. We're still defending the right of all workers to be able to have that time. Someone thought of the idea that women, identified people, poor people, and people of color should be able to vote and participate, for better or for worse, in democratic, quote unquote, structures in this country. Organizing won it, and we struggle to protect the right still. Someone thought of the idea that women and people of color are not property. While we struggle for autonomy, organizing has won us so much, right? The idea that physically some of us are property of others is a pretty profound seismic worldview shift that didn't come because people who felt that they owned us decided that they didn't want to own us anymore. It was because we decided that we didn't deserve to be owned. And our ancestors decided that we didn't deserve to belong to anyone else. And someone thought of the idea that LGBTQ people are not sick deviants. Some of us went into our own experience and didn't find sickness there. We found wholeness and possibility in what we have to share with the world. And we refuse to accept another story anymore. So finally, organizing in social movements. It's about love, but it's also about power, y'all. Talked about Frederick Douglass, here he is again. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has, and it never will. So the work of social change would be much more comfortable for all of us, especially those of us who hold a lot of power, and working across lines of race, class, gender, sexuality, ability, and culture, if history taught us that power gave itself over easily when oppression becomes visible to all. The reality is that social movements move in many ways and in many stages and phases. It's not simple, but all great social movements are authentically grounded in people directly affected by an issue, pushing, loving, building, working until power concedes. So what does this mean? It means that part of what we think the spiritual work of social movements is about is to be able to deal with the discomfort of that for those of us who hold power, and to be able to believe and listen to folks as people are saying, I'm actually not going to do it this way anymore. I'm not going to participate anymore. I'm not going to be part of my own oppression this way anymore. And the question is, do people want to move with me as I'm moving for justice and liberation or not? So when marginalized and oppressed people are saying that to those of us who have different privileges, this is a question we're engaging, and it's a deeply spiritual question, because it's actually about what does it take to be able to challenge power, and how do we challenge power in a loving way. So that's one of the main things we're going to be exploring in this course, because it's not an easy thing to explore. So thanks so much, everybody, for listening to the PowerPoint scenario. So here's what we're going to do. This is the first course. I want you to spend some time connecting with the discussion questions, the quiz questions, which called quiz roughly, but optional, and sharing your reflections and questions on this. There was a lot of content here, and we really hope that this starts some conversation, and sending you a lot of love and blessings wherever you are in your day-to-day, hoping that some of this was of use for you.